Her family betrayed and tied her up in public, until her uncle walked in with a life-changing lesson. Amara's world spun as she struggled against the rough, scratchy ropes cutting into her wrists. The crowd gathered in the village square seemed to grow with every passing moment, their jeers blending into a deafening roar of humiliation. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of betrayal and disbelief. These were her people, her family, people who should have loved and protected her. Yet here she was, bound and displayed like a criminal for a sin she didn't commit. It had started 3 days earlier. The whispers, the side eyes, the sudden coldness from her cousins. At first, Amara had brushed it off, believing it to be one of those fleeting misunderstandings that often arose in tight-knit families. But the tension had grown, and soon, her parents' home, once a place of comfort, felt like a cage closing in around her. She had tried to ask her mother what was wrong, but her mother wouldn't meet her gaze. "You know what you've done," she muttered, brushing past her. Her father, a man of few words but boundless warmth, had been silent, his face shadowed with something between anger and shame. The silence was unbearable, yet no one would explain. On the third day, they came for her. Her cousins, uncles, and even her father burst into her room. Their faces were stern, their voices sharp. "You've brought shame to this family," her eldest cousin declared, her voice trembling with anger. "What are you talking about?" Amara's voice cracked, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket around her. "You know what you did," her father said coldly. The weight of his voice crushed her. Before she could respond, they grabbed her arms and dragged her out of the house. She kicked and screamed, her pleas echoing off the clay walls of the village. The people of the town emerged from their homes, their faces alight with curiosity and judgment. And now, here she was, tied up, accused of a crime she didn't understand. Her tears stung her cheeks as she scanned the crowd, searching for someone, anyone, who might intervene. That's when she saw him. Her uncle, Ferris, strode into the square, his face calm but determined. His presence was like a gust of wind scattering the suffocating haze. Ferris was an outlier in the family, a man of unconventional ideas who often clashed with the others. Amara had always felt a special bond with him, his kindness a stark contrast to the rigidity of her parents and cousins. "What is going on here?" Ferris's voice cut through the noise, commanding attention. "She's shamed us, Ferris," Amara's father said, stepping forward. "She's dishonored the family." Ferris raised an eyebrow. "And you decided that tying her up in front of the entire village was the solution? What exactly has she done?" She consorted with an outsider," one of her cousins blurted out. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Amara's mouth fell open in shock. "That's not true," she cried. "I've done nothing wrong." Ferris's gaze swept over the crowd, silencing their whispers. "Do you have proof? Or are we condemning someone based on assumptions and gossip?" The family hesitated. They exchanged glances, their confidence faltering under Ferris's piercing stare. Ferris turned back to Amara, his expression softening. "Amara, do you trust me?" Her throat tightened, but she managed a nod. "Yes." "Then let me handle this." He stepped closer to her father. "You've made your point. Release her." The tension in the air was palpable as her father wavered, his pride warring with his uncertainty. Finally, he gave a curt nod, and one of the cousins reluctantly untied the ropes. Amara collapsed to the ground, her legs too weak to support her. Ferris crouched beside her, his hand firm on her shoulder. "Come," he said quietly. "Let's go." He guided her out of the square, away from the murmuring crowd and the accusing glares of her family. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of the village. Only then did Amara's tears flow freely, the weight of her ordeal crashing down on her. Ferris let her cry, his presence steady and comforting. When her sobs subsided, he spoke. "Do you know why they did this?" Amara shook her head. "They said I dishonored them, but it's not true. I haven't done anything." Ferris sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, people act out of fear. They cling to traditions and appearances, and they lash out when they feel threatened. But that doesn't make what they did right. What do I do now?" Amara whispered. Ferris looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. You rise. You learn. And you prove to yourself, not to them, that you are stronger than this. Amara didn't understand what he meant, not fully, but there was something in his voice that stirred a flicker of hope within her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ferris led her to his home at the edge of the forest. It was a simple, sturdy house, surrounded by the lush greenery that Amara had always loved. He gave her a warm meal and a place to rest, and for the first time in days, she felt safe. Over the coming weeks, Ferris began to teach her. He shared stories of his own struggles, his own battles against the narrow-mindedness of their family. He taught her skills, practical, physical, and emotional, that she had never been encouraged to develop. You are not defined by their expectations, he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. You are defined by your choices. Amara clung to his words, letting them guide her as she began to rebuild herself. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of strength within her, a strength that no one could take away. In the weeks that followed, Amara found herself immersed in a world she'd never known. Ferris had a way of teaching that was both gentle and relentless. Each morning, he woke her before sunrise, taking her out to the forest where they trained in silence. At first, it was simple physical tasks, hauling logs, climbing trees, running along uneven trails. Amara's muscles ached in ways she hadn't thought possible, but with each passing day, she grew stronger. What is this supposed to teach me? She asked one morning, out of breath after scaling a particularly tall oak tree. Ferris smirked, handing her a flask of water. Discipline, resilience, and focus. If you can conquer the forest, you can conquer the whispers of a village. But it wasn't just her body that Ferris was strengthening. Evenings were spent in deep conversations by the fire. He taught her about the power of words, the importance of understanding people's fears and motivations, and the necessity of standing tall even when the world seemed determined to push her down. Why do you care so much about teaching me? Amara asked one night, her voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. Ferris gazed into the flames, his face illuminated by their flickering light. Because I've seen what happens when someone lets the weight of others' judgment crush them. I've seen dreams die, potential wasted. I've felt it myself. And I don't want that for you. His words stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she lay awake in the small room he had given her. The pain of her family's betrayal was still there, a dull ache that refused to fade, but it no longer felt insurmountable. One day, as they walked through the forest, Ferris handed Amara a smooth, polished staff. "Show me what you've learned," he said. Amara hesitated, her grip on the staff uncertain. "I've never fought anyone before." "This isn't about fighting," Ferris said. "It's about standing your ground. Pretend I'm the voices in the square. The accusations, the judgment. Show me how you'll face them." His words lit a spark within her. With a deep breath, Amara planted her feet and raised the staff. Ferris came at her, his movements swift but deliberate. At first, she faltered, her strikes clumsy and hesitant. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. Her movements became more fluid, her strikes more confident. She wasn't just swinging a staff, she was channeling every ounce of frustration, every tear she'd cried, every moment of humiliation. When Ferris finally called a halt, she was out of breath but exhilarated. "Not bad," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Not bad at all." Months passed, and the seasons began to change. The once green forest was now ablaze with the fiery hues of autumn. Amara had grown in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her body was lean and strong, her mind sharp and focused. But more importantly, she had found a sense of self-worth that no one could take from her. One crisp morning, Ferris approached her as she tended to the small garden behind his house. "It's time," he said simply. "Time for what?" Amara asked, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Time to return to the village." Her heart skipped a beat. She had avoided thinking about the village, about her family, about the people who had turned on her. The thought of facing them again filled her with a mix of dread and determination. "What if they still see me as a disgrace?" she asked quietly. Ferris placed a hand on her shoulder. "What they see is irrelevant. What matters is how you see yourself. When they arrived at the village, the streets were just as Amara remembered, narrow and bustling, lined with the familiar clay houses. But as they walked through, she noticed the stares, the whispers. The same faces that had watched her humiliation months ago now looked at her with a mix of curiosity and unease. She held her head high, refusing to let their gazes weigh her down. They reached her family's home, and Ferris knocked on the door. Her mother opened it, her face pale as she took in the sight of her daughter. "Amara," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Mother," Amara replied, her tone steady. Her father appeared behind her mother, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here?" he asked gruffly. "To speak my truth," Amara said. The strength in her voice surprised even herself. "You condemned me without proof, without a chance to defend myself. I have come to tell you that I will not live under the shadow of your judgment." Her father's jaw tightened. "And what makes you think you can speak to us this way?" "Because I know my worth," she replied. "And because I have learned that love and respect should not be conditional." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Her father's stern facade cracked, and for a moment, Amara saw something she hadn't expected: regret. Ferris stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You may not realize it yet, but Amara is stronger than any of you gave her credit for. And whether you accept her or not, she will thrive." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, her mother reached out, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Amara hesitated, the pain of betrayal still fresh. But as she looked into her mother's eyes, she saw sincerity. She nodded slowly, though she knew forgiveness would take time. Amara's return to the village marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for her family as well. Though the wounds of the past would never fully heal, they served as a reminder of her journey, of the strength she had found within herself. And as she stood in the heart of the village, the sun setting behind her, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the girl who had been tied up in the square. She was a woman forged by fire, and she would never be silenced again. Amara spent the next few weeks in the village cautiously rebuilding her relationships, not just with her family but also with the community. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the pain of the past resurfaced, when a passing whisper or a lingering glance reminded her of her humiliation. But Ferris's lessons had prepared her well. "You don't need their approval," he reminded her one evening as they sat by the village well. "You're here to live your truth, not to rewrite theirs." Amara took those words to heart. Instead of seeking acceptance, she focused on creating her path. She began helping in the community, teaching children how to read, assisting the elderly with their daily chores, and sharing the skills she'd learned from Ferris. Slowly, the villagers' views began to shift. They saw her not as a symbol of shame, but as a source of strength and kindness. One day, as Amara was tending to the fields, her father approached her. He looked older than she remembered, his shoulders heavy with the weight of unspoken words. For a moment, he simply stood there, as if searching for the right thing to say. "I was wrong," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara paused, her hands still gripping the handle of the hoe. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "I let fear guide me," he said. "Fear of what the community would think. Fear of losing the family's reputation. And in doing so, I lost sight of what truly mattered." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Amara studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was regret. "You hurt me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You hurt me in a way I didn't think was possible." "I know," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know that I see you now. Not as the girl I thought you should be, but as the woman you've become." Amara's throat tightened. For so long, she had dreamed of hearing those words, but now that they were here, they felt bittersweet. She nodded slowly. "Forgiveness isn't easy," she said. "But I'm willing to try." Her father's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in years, he smiled at her, a small, tentative smile, but one that held the promise of change. In the months that followed, Amara's relationship with her family continued to heal. Her mother became her strongest supporter, often joining her in her community work. Her father, though still reserved, began to show his pride in quieter ways, by offering her advice, by sharing stories of his own struggles, by simply sitting beside her in comfortable silence. Ferris, true to his nature, remained a guiding force. "You've done well, Amara," he said one evening as they sat on the porch of his home. "But this is just the beginning." "What do you mean?" she asked. "You've rebuilt yourself here," he said. "But the world is vast, and there's so much more to learn, so much more to experience. Don't let this be your end." His words sparked something within her, a sense of curiosity and adventure that had been buried beneath the weight of her past. She realized that while the village would always be her home, it didn't have to be her whole world. When the day came for her to leave, the village gathered to see her off. Her father and mother stood at the front of the crowd, their faces a mixture of pride and sadness. Ferris stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're sure about this?" her father asked, his voice thick with emotion. Amara smiled, her heart full. "Yes. But I'll be back. I promise." Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace. "Be safe," she whispered. "And never forget how proud we are of you." Amara turned to Ferris, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He smiled. "Go make your mark on the world, Amara. And remember, no matter where you go, your strength is your own." With one last look at her family and the village that had shaped her, Amara set off down the road, her heart light and her spirit unshakable. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: she was ready. And so, Amara's journey began anew, not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who had risen above it, stronger and more determined than ever. Her story, though shaped by pain, was ultimately one of resilience, growth, and the unbreakable power of the human spirit. And as she walked into the horizon, she carried with her the lessons of her past and the promise of a future filled with endless possibilities.